Hey, what's going on? This is the Body Punch Podcast, and my name is Naz. Let's talk about MMA news. With a bunch of the big name fighters coming out and talking about their plans, I thought it'd be important to discuss this because we got a lot of interesting tidbits of information from these fighters, which include Khabib Nurmagomedov, Max Holloway, TJ Dillashaw, and then we also got Aljamain Sterling. And like I said, a bunch of great information that we got in these interviews. And I just wanted to dissect all of this MMA news. Let's talk about the first topic. So this was actually discussed in Ariel Helwani and DC's podcast, where they were talking about Khabib Nurmagomedov having the mumps before his fight with Justin Gaethje. Khabib discussed this with an a Russian MMA outlet, where he showed them a picture of his face, and it was massive. And the reason I wanted to discuss this was, like I said, this is right before the fight that he had with Justin Gaethje. On top of this, Khabib Nurmagomedov had some foot injuries going into that. And then we all know the loss that he had from his father's passing. This shows us how amazing Khabib Nurmagomedov is. For him to go into that fight with Justin Gaethje, who at the time many people were saying was the Khabib killer, could be the Khabib killer. A guy that could come in there, use his wrestling, which he hadn't shown at the time as much. He could use his wrestling to nullify Khabib Nurmagomedov's takedown and keep him on the feet to use his heavy hitting hands. That was the narrative going into the fight. Obviously, Khabib Nurmagomedov had his own narrative where people were saying he was going to do exactly what he did. I think many people were surprised by the triangle choke that he got Justin Gaethje with. But going into this fight, it's not like Justin Gaethje was some sort of pushover. He was a real threat to that 155-pound belt. And to think that Khabib Nurmagomedov had this virus, then he had his leg injury, and then on top of that, he was going to fight without his father, who is also his head coach. Shows you the levels that this guy is above most of the other fighters. It's just incredible. With all of this stuff coming out now, and I just want to make a note that he didn't talk about this before the fight. He didn't make any excuses, and he came into this fight knowing that he had these 3 disadvantages, maybe even more that he hasn't even discussed. And he still beat Justin Gaethje in a way where it was just fundamental. He did whatever he wanted to do. He said that he wanted to choke Justin Gaethje out because his parents were in the arena and he knew what it might feel like to see someone get ground and pounded or maybe even knocked out. So he did what he thought was right, which was to submit Justin Gaethje. So before we move on from this topic, I just wanted to discuss something that's going around, and it is Khabib Nurmagomedov's soccer career, which is one of the most funny things to say. But Ariel Helwani, in his podcast with Daniel Cormier, talked about how this could be like Michael Jordan playing baseball. I think that this is just a play. This is just one way Khabib Nurmagomedov is just keeping his name in the news. Not that he would think about doing something like that. And what I mean by that is just using his name as clickbait. But I think this is just one of the ways that he might be joking around. He might be, I don't know what to make of this. This is unheard of for our sport, MMA. We don't get many multi-sport athletes that do it in the prime of their career. We've had a bunch of football players do it. We have some football players that were Hall of Famers, but they come in the twilight of their career, or it might be some other reason. We've had some MMA fighters go into boxing, but that is almost a cousin to the sport of MMA. It's a little bit more of a accepted idea that an MMA athlete could go into another combat sport like kickboxing, boxing, jiu-jitsu. But not in this time. We've had someone come out and say that they're going to play professional soccer the way that Khabib Nurmagomedov has said. But I just thought that was interesting. I don't know what to make of it, to be honest with you. We need more information about Khabib's soccer career, which is just funny to say. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was Max Holloway's future, which he discussed with Ariel Helwani. There was a bunch of amazing tidbits that came out of this conversation that Max had with Ariel Helwani. And at the beginning, he talked about how his fight with Calvin Kattar was his greatest fight. Now, there was a lot of discussions going into that. And I think having Max Holloway's seal of approval, saying that his Calvin Kattar fight was his greatest performance, is just, like I said, the seal of approval that we need to justify that claim. And the next thing he talked about, which I brought up in the previous shows of that fight and the post shows podcast that I made about that Calvin Kattar fight, but I really wanted to know what was the effects that Max Holloway received from being the main event on the ABC card. Now, he talked about in this interview with Ariel Helwani that he's gained many fans. He's talked about how his social media stock has gone up and how other fighters are interested in fighting on a non-pay-per-view card. I think this is very interesting. This could be something that affects the sport. Not that many fighters have a choice of when they're going to fight. It seems like when the UFC or any MMA organization says you're going to fight on this date, they don't really mind. Some fighters have even come out and said that the earlier that they fight, the better it is for them so they can get out of the arena and celebrate. But I just thought it was very interesting to see how Max Holloway and to listen how Max Holloway discussed this main event spot on ABC. And it might be the way that a lot of fighters want to move forward in their career. Hey, it might make a lot more sense. you might get a lot more eyeballs just being on free TV, especially ABC, which has the reach it does. And another thing that Max Holloway talked about in this interview was the fact that he was very serious about fighting Dustin Poirier and Conor McGregor. Some people might have thought that it was just kind of a throwout line that he mentioned Dustin Poirier and Conor McGregor and just saying it just to get some clout, but he was dead serious on fighting one of those fighters if they dropped out. And I mean, could you imagine a fight with either Conor McGregor or Dustin Poirier, which would both be rematches? That would have been incredible. But he was dead honest on fighting one of those fighters. And that brings me into the next topic that they talked about, which was Max Holloway brought up a very good point and it's a very interesting point because it gives us an idea of his mindset. And he said for him to be on the pound for pound list and for any fighter to be on the pound for pound list, then they should move up in weight or take over another weight division, if you will. And that brought up the conversation of Max Holloway becoming full-time committed to the 155-pound division. He says that he feels like his last couple fights, he will end his career in the 155-pound division, which is interesting, very interesting. I think that a lot of people just scratched Max Holloway's 155-pound career because of his fight with Dustin Poirier. But we need to understand that Dustin Poirier is at the top of that division. And Max Holloway took that on 2 months' notice. Was he really able to be prepared for that fight the way that he wanted to be? What if the Max Holloway that fought Calvin Kattar fought Dustin Poirier? And we got to remember at the time, even though the 155-pound division is higher than the 145-pound division that he fights at, he was having some weight cut issues. Max Holloway mentioned in this interview that every time they cut weight, they're learning new things, which is going to be interesting if he has a couple more fights, which he did mention in this interview. He wants to have 3 fights this year. They could be title fights or non-title fights, but obviously he feels like he is ready for the winner of Volkov versus Brian Ortega. And that fight totally makes sense to me. Either he fights Volkov, where everybody believes, or a lot of people believe, that Max Holloway won that fight. And then to fight Brian Ortega, I feel like Brian Ortega would take that fight in a heartbeat because of the devastating loss that he took to Max Holloway. It would be redemption for him. But I think it was an interesting point that he mentioned. He said that he either wants a non-title fight, but he believes that he is the one next for the winner of that title fight. And the 155-pound commitment totally makes sense to me as well. Once he is totally committed to 155, then we'll see the true potential that he has at that weight division. I think right now a lot of people are writing him off because he did take that fight on short notice. So I think we need to see the true potential of Max Holloway at that weight division, which can only be done if he commits to 155. Another thing I wanted to mention from this interview he had with Ariel Helwani was Max Holloway mentioned Conor McGregor's style. if you've listened to my last podcast, which was one of my last podcasts, which was about the Conor McGregor style that he displayed in that Dustin Poirier fight, I really believe that it's due to the stances that he's dealing with. Conor McGregor's style is very much used in a way that if he sees a southpaw, he'll fight in one stance. If he fights another type of fighter, then he'll use that other type of stance. It's very dependent on the stance that his opponent is using. So I think that Max Holloway discussed the bouncy kind of low stance that Conor McGregor has shown with other right-handed fighters. But I think this is totally due to the fact that Conor McGregor's style adapts to the fighter that he's fighting. And the last thing I wanted to talk about this Max Holloway interview was that he feels like, and he's mentioned this time and time again in a bunch of his interviews, is that he feels like he has a style to beat Khabib Nurmagomedov. He mentioned Khabib Nurmagomedov and his press conference that they had, and how it was the press conference that Khabib Nurmagomedov said the most. Now, I don't know about the press conference, but I want to talk about the fight. This would be a massive, interesting fight. But I think that we have to go back to Max Holloway's old point, which was his commitment to 155. I don't think they should put him in right away with Khabib Nurmagomedov. I think he needs to do the thing that he's talking about and show the commitment at the weight class before he fights for that belt. And anyways, I think that before any of this 155-pound stuff, he has to fight for that belt. I think that fight totally makes sense. It's the fight that's right for him, and he's interested. And I'm sure, especially Brian Ortega, if he wins that fight, he will be totally into that. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was on the Mike Swick podcast. He had TJ Dillashaw on there, and he talked about his future. TJ has talked about this before in previous interviews that he's done, but the double shoulder surgery that he had after he got caught for using performance-enhancing drugs, that might make a massive difference in this fighter. TJ Dillashaw was talking about how he wasn't able to grapple at all before getting this surgery done to both of his shoulders. And funny enough, he mentioned that he got this injury from a tough challenge that he had with Cody Garbrandt. I don't know if you guys have seen that clip, but they were playing tetherball, and he injured his shoulder in that mini game or whatever that they had for that tough series. Man, the life of an athlete is so tough. You can't even, like, you're taking a risk just playing tetherball. Like, that is totally a horrible situation that happened, but he said himself that he wasn't able to grapple before any of his fights after sustaining that injury. So can you imagine what TJ Dillashaw is going to be like when he comes back? Because there's a bunch of questions. He also noted that he's 35 years old. He says that he's improving, but he is 35 years old. Like, we can't forget that fact. So there's a lot of questions on TJ Dillashaw's return. Will he be the same fighter? Will he be the same person that had all of those amazing fights? he mentioned that the reason he did those performance enhancing drugs was due to the fact of the horrible weight cut that he had. He mentioned that, he was having a horrible time cutting that weight. And it was the only reason he did what he needed to do. I don't subscribe that he should have done that. It's a horrible thing that he did. But now we got to ask the question, because this guy is coming back to the UFC. He is coming back. And we have to ask ourselves the question, what is this guy going to be like when he does make his return? Because he's going to affect that bantamweight division. I don't expect him to cut down in weight again, but he is going to affect that bantamweight division. And once he is involved, this guy's at the top level. So we have to think now, is it going to be an age issue where the guy's where he took this 2-year layoff and now he's coming back. He is 35, but he fixed his shoulders. What kind of TJ Dillashaw are we going to see? That's the question. He talked about some of his fights that he's interested in, and I think the Henry Cejudo fight that he wants could be a way to get Henry Cejudo back. It's a fight that kind of makes sense, but it's going to have to happen at that 135-pound division. He also mentioned Corey Sandhagen. He mentioned Jose Aldo. I think that fight makes the most sense. A Jose Aldo fight. Jose Aldo at that bantamweight division has shown that it might be the thing that he needed to renew his career. But then we saw him get defeated a couple times. But this might be the right fight. I think the TJ Dillashaw and Jose Aldo fight is probably the right fight. And it's got some backstory that TJ Dillashaw mentioned in this interview. When he was training at an alpha male, Jose Aldo was the boogeyman for those guys. He was defeating a couple of his teammates. Even though TJ is not close with any of those guys at alpha male. He might be close with a couple people, but it does have that backstory. And I think that's the perfect fight for him to come back to. So last interview I wanted to talk about. By the way, I'm going through this list of interviews. It shows you how amazing the sport, like the stars that we have in this sport, they do an interview and it could affect the whole UFC and MMA in general. But the last guy is Aljamain Sterling. He has a fight coming up against Petr Yan, a highly anticipated fight. Aljamain has wanted this fight before. He didn't get it. But he mentioned in this interview that he had with Brett Okamoto that he doesn't know, and I don't think anybody knows, the true potential of Petr Yan. He feels like he is the next and best test for him to show how great he is. If he does defeat Aljamain Sterling, it's going to be a massive feat, because this is the guy that choked out Corey Sandhagen in that 1-round fight. So this is going to be a massive test for him. This is going to show where Petr Yan is. A lot of people have put him into the position that he is, and some people feel like he hasn't really been tested. We can look at Petr Yan's style, and I've talked about this in past podcasts, but his stand-up game is very advanced, especially in the Uriah Faber fight. We saw the advanced striking that he showed. I think some people might say that Uriah Faber was over the hill in that fight, but we are still able to parse out what Petr Yan was doing. He was throwing a lot of fakes. That style that he has, the mixture of the Thai style that he has and the amazing crisp boxing, we saw that in that fight. So we can judge him on a couple things, but I think Aljamain's right. This is the real test for Petr Yan, is what's going to happen when they get into the cage. Because Aljamain mentioned a bunch of times in this interview that he wants to apply Khabib Nurmagomedov pressure against Petr Yan. He feels like Yan hasn't been tested by the BJJ skills that Aljamain possesses. He thinks that his BJJ is the thing that's going to win him this fight. And we're going to see. We're going to see, because I think Aljamain's right in this situation. And I think he's right by saying that Petr Yan hasn't been tested with a person that's always going to go after those takedowns. And we're going to see what happens. We're going to see what happens. And we're going to see if Petr Yan's wrestling is at the level that a lot of people have been talking about. This is the true test. I'm going to keep on mentioning this in this podcast, but I think that Aljamain Sterling is the true test for Petr Yan. And he's already giving out the game plan. He says that he's going to use his BJJ in this fight. Obviously, in every fight, you're going to use it, but he says that this is the tool to defeating Petr Yan. And funny enough, he mentioned that the Corey Sandhagen fight that he had was harder than this fight is going to be. We don't know yet, but it's crazy that he's saying this, because we all know the capabilities that Corey Sandhagen has, and for Aljamain Sterling to do what he did against Corey Sandhagen, especially now, him going on the run that he's going on, defeating some top rank fighters, you see the capabilities of Corey Sandhagen. And it just shows you how amazing Aljamain Sterling is for doing what he did. But Aljamain also mentioned the boxing of Petr Yan and how that is a key asset for him. So he's already talking about how Petr Yan's striking is amazing, which I think we can admit, even though the competition that he has faced isn't the competition like Aljamain Sterling, we can still see that he's got the fundamentals in his striking correct. I think this is going to be a super fun fight. Really fun fight. And especially in this weight class, this bantamweight division full of killers, this is the perfect fight to make. So that was the podcast about some MMA news that came out this week. I love parsing out this kind of stuff and listening to the podcast and the interviews that these fighters do. And it gives us a lot of information about the upcoming fights, especially like fights that are just about to come up and the future of some fighters that have been laid off. But it was fun talking about this. I really enjoy it. If you guys could like, subscribe, hit the bell notification on YouTube, that'd be really appreciated. If you guys could listen to the podcast on all the different podcast platforms, that'd be amazing. Give it a follow, 5 stars, all that good stuff. Again, thank you for taking the time to listen to me talk. This has been the Body Punch Podcast. My name is Naz. Bye.